For my professional practice reflection, I chose to make a PowerPoint and I thought I would do a voiceover to explain what I've written in a little more depth. So, for the experience constructing the rubric, I really enjoyed working with the seventh grade team in small groups to create the portions of the rubric we had chosen. The discourse that we had as a group really helped me to think about my teaching and my beliefs and how I thought that we should be evaluating each other. And so I really enjoyed that experience. However, when we compiled the rubric as an entire class and then broke out into different groups on topic, not grade level, I found it a little more frustrating, mainly because it was hard for all of us to come to a consensus on our opinions. And as you know, many of us have very strong opinions and are not afraid to voice them. So that aspect of it was a little bit frustrating to me. But I am happy with the final product that we came up with together as a class. Um, the next items that you will see are the professional projects rubric and my grading that I have done of myself, a self-assessment of my teaching in the fall that we videoed, the fall of 2012, so before we'd really learned anything from iSmart. Um, for teacher content area, I gave myself a 4, stating that I was an expert in the subject matter and up to date on authoritative research on child development and how students learn. I didn't need to look at notes. I knew the content and I could help my students if questions arise. For anticipation of student understanding and misconceptions, I gave myself a 3 um, because I did not teach to the misconceptions but was ready to address them when they came up. On integration, this was not an integrated lesson, so obviously I gave myself a 1 because I did not have any connections or relationships to other subject areas. I gave myself a 4 for repertoire of strategies and materials. The activity that I did here with my students used many different strategies and engaged students in many different ways. For example, when they came into class, we were using sticky notes and deciding where different words fit and what they meant. And then after we figured that out together, we went into some notes on using a PowerPoint, and students were getting up and solving problems and doing work, and so we were using many different strategies. I gave myself a 3 for differentiation because I was hitting the different types of learning styles. Um, However, students did not have different assignments, so I didn't feel like I'd met the criteria for 4. For questioning, I gave myself a 2. Most questions are knowledge or comprehension, but do include some application and or analysis. Um, I felt like I was asking my students to recall some information, but also apply it in a new way, but not to the extent of a 3 or a 4, where the students were really evaluating and applying and analyzing with the questions that I provided. Academic feedback, again, I gave myself a 2 um, because I did provide explanations, but I did not feel like they were as clear as they could have been, nor did I feel like there was as much feedback as I give to my students now. Um, Student engagement in terms of communication, I gave a 4 because my students were very active in the activity and very much interested as well. Again, anticipation of student understanding and misconception, I gave myself a 3 because I didn't plan for the misconceptions, but was able to address them. Proficiency of delivery and transition, I gave myself a 2. Sometimes loses teaching time due to lack of clarity and interruptions and inefficient transitions. Had a lot of technical difficulties with this lesson, It's not very evident on the video as the person who was recording it kind of stopped in the middle so I could get myself together, but I do remember having to deal with that in the activity, and so I lost some class time and wanted to make note of that. And finally, student engagement. I gave myself a 4 because the students were actively participating and discussing in the activity. They were on task and they were involved. And lastly, student-centered classroom. Student learning is sometimes self-directed. I felt like I did a lot of talking in this lesson. I know the students were engaged and able to participate as well, but I did not feel like it was as student-centered as it could be. Next, we'll get into the fall of 2013 teaching. So this is before our Critical Friends cycle this semester. For this, I gave myself a 4 on teacher content knowledge. Again, I know the subject area and did not need to refer to any notes or so on and so forth. I gave myself a 3 on the anticipation of student understanding and misconceptions. I feel like this is something that I still struggle with. I don't necessarily teach to the trouble spots or misconceptions, but do address them as they arrive. Again, for integration, I gave myself a 1 because it was not an integrated lesson, so therefore there was no connections to another subject area. For repertoire of strategies and materials, I gave myself a 4, mainly because I felt like I was using a strategy that all of my students could relate to. They were creating their own product and had ownership of this lesson, and I felt like this was a good strategy for them. For differentiation, again, since the students had ownership of their lesson and were able to create their own product, this really links to all learners. And different students were allowed to choose different topics and create their own story that went with a proportional relationship. Questioning, I gave myself a 3 this time. I felt like my questions were higher level blooms. My students were applying what they knew. They were creating their own product and using the creation level of blooms. On academic feedback, I felt like I did a good job of giving students an example of what they were required to make. They understood that they needed to pick a pattern and create an equation and so on and so forth. And I gave them feedback as I went around explaining, hey, I don't think this is right. And that way they were able to correct their any misconceptions before they turned in their final product. For student engagement in terms of communication, I gave myself a 3 as the students were actively discussing the activity, but they didn't ask me a lot of questions, and I didn't know if maybe that was because they understood or just didn't want to talk. I'm not sure. For the anticipation of student understanding and misconception, again, I said, gave myself a 3 because I have plans to address any misconceptions, but I didn't teach to the trouble spots. For the proficiency and delivery of transition, gave myself a 3 because I felt like we used that room time very well with very minimal disruptions from student behavior. Finally, with student engagement, I gave myself a 4 because all of my students were on task and using their knowledge to apply to the assignment they were given. And for student-centered classroom, I gave myself a 3 because the student learning was mostly self-directed. Like I said at the beginning, I gave some instructions and an example, and then from the rest of the class, the students were really taking ownership of their learning and doing what they needed to do to construct their knowledge, not me talking at them and saying, this is what you need to know. Next, I will go over my self-assessment from my Critical Friends teaching, which I think this shows some of my best teaching that I have learned through iSmart. For teacher content knowledge, I gave myself a 4, being an expert in the subject area. Didn't need to refer to notes or anything like that. Um, Again, with anticipation of student understanding and misconceptions, I think this is something I struggle with. Instead of teaching to the misconceptions so that maybe the students don't have them, I just address them as they arise. Um, for integration, I do feel like I could have integrated this lesson a little bit better, but I did make some valid connections between science and mathematics and how we can analyze data and do things like that that we've gained from some sort of science experiment, which in this case was analyzing data collected on a field trip, learning about um, alternative energy sources. For repertoire of strategies and materials, I stated that I gave myself a 4 orchestrated highly effective strategies because we were using technology. The kids were very involved, they were listening, participating. Differentiation. Differentiation is linked to individuals with adequate detail. I gave myself a 3 there because my students were given a choice of how they wanted to create their graphs and were able to use different things to do so. For questioning, I gave myself a 3 because we were really, we were analyzing. We were analyzing data, and that is definitely in the higher level of Bloom's, which I felt was very strong. For academic feedback, again, I gave myself a 3 because I felt like I really provided a lot of feedback for the students with clear expectations and walking around the room and steering them in the right direction when I thought that maybe they could provide better information. For student engagement in terms of communication, my students were so involved, so I gave myself a 4. I really don't feel like there was any kid that was off task during this activity. They were discussing in their groups, they were having great discourse, and it was really exciting to see. Um, Again, a 3 on anticipation of student understanding and misconceptions. And then proficiency and delivery of transitions, I gave myself a 4. I don't feel like we lost any class time. If I was talking, they were listening, and if it was time for them to work, they were working. For student engagement, again, a 4. All of the students were on task and involved in the activity. For the student-centered classroom, I gave myself a 3 because the student learning was mostly student self-directed. They were offered choices in how they created their graphs. They were offered choices in what they were doing, so that was nice. And getting into the dilemmas for when I face conceptual dilemmas in my classroom, I like to reteach the concepts, research new ways to teach concepts, um, have peers explain the concepts to each other. It's amazing what students can learn from each other, or to seek advice from other teachers with more experience. When I myself face pedagogical dilemmas, I make sure I do my best to research best practices and find new ways to light my fire. I definitely reflect upon what I've learned from iSmart and what I really believe pedagogically, which helps me get through these times, and also reach out to colleagues for help and guidance. Um, Cultural and political dilemmas, I feel like I don't face that as much as working in a private school. Um, Culturally, most of my students are not from the same ethnicity or race, but can't come from the same walks of life. They're all middle class, and so I don't feel like they face a lot of those cultural dilemmas. And politically, I don't feel like there's a lot of politics in my school because we don't face the No Child Left Behind Act or having to do STAR testing and so on and so forth. Um, for beliefs on best practices for teaching, I use inquiry-based lessons. I minimize direct instruction, student-centered learning. I make sure students construct their own learning, use the necessity principle when applying it to all lessons, and make sure I'm using meaningful assessments. I do believe that I'm striving towards being a constructivist teacher. I'm not there yet. It's important for my students to construct their own learning through meaningful experiences and prior knowledge. I struggle with implementing these beliefs um, because one, I wasn't taught this way, and two, I don't feel like I have all the resources needed to be a constructivist teacher. And finally, do my practices reflect my beliefs about teaching and learning. And I don't feel like they always do. I feel like I'm growing and learning